Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Punaktu Sahaviryam Karvavahai Tejasvinavadhi Tamastu Ma Vidvisavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May He protect us. May He sustain us. May we grow in strength together. May our study together be fruitful. And may we not hate one another. Peace, peace, peace. So good morning or evening, and welcome to the class. So we've gotten into chapter 2 of the Katha Upanishad. Chapter 1 told the story about Nachiketa and how he ended up going to the abode of Yama, the god of death. And when he got there, Yama wasn't home, and so for 3 days he sat outside his door without food or anything. And then when Yama returned, he apologized that he hadn't treated him properly as a guest, as a Brahmin, and that in exchange he offered him 3 boons. And we saw that the first boon Nachiketa asked for was that his father would have peace of mind and not be angry with him anymore, and recognize him when he came back home. And the second boon was that he wanted to learn how to perform a fire worship which would take a person to heaven. And so Yama told him, gave instructions on how to build the fire, how to perform the worship properly. And because Nachiketas was such a good student, now Yama said that from now on this particular worship, this would be called the Nachiketa sacrifice. And so he granted that. Then the third boon, though, that Nachiketas asked for was that some people say the person survives after death, and some people say he doesn't. And I want to know the truth about that. And then Yama began to hedge and say, well, that's a very difficult question. Even the gods aren't sure about that, so ask something else. And then he began to offer. Nachiketa said, look, I give you wealth, progeny, long life, master ruler, you can rule over the earth, all kinds of anything your heart desires, I'll give you, but just don't ask that question. But then Nachiketa responded and said, no, this is the only thing I want, is to know the truth about the ultimate truth about things. And so then this brought us into chapter 2, where the actual teachings began. The first chapter just kind of set the scene, and now the teachings began in chapter 2. And the very first thing that Yama had said to Nachiketas was that the good and the pleasant are 2 different things, and they just serve different purposes. Each is, however, a bondage, though not in the same sense. He who chooses the good does good to himself, but he who chooses the pleasant misses the purpose of life. And so Yama explained that before each person, these 2 paths open up. One is the path of the pleasant, where the focus is on the external world, on enjoying the external world, and trying to find happiness there. And the other path is the path of Shreyas, of the good, of trying to find out, moving towards the higher truth. Now, as we said before, the whole principle behind all the spiritual teachings and all is simply that we can live in different states of consciousness. That, as Swami Varadananda said, we all exist as 3 different beings simultaneously. One level, we're a physical being. We're a physical body, physical sensations. We see and hear things and see a world outside ourselves. Second level, we're a mental being, where when a person becomes more introspective, he starts to become aware the mind is there. And this is the source of knowledge, of beauty, of understanding, of inspiration. A whole vast realm begins to open up. And then, but thirdly, we also exist as spirit, as Atman, as the eternal spirit, and that's one with God forever. And that's our real self. And this is the state. As people meditate, as people begin to go within deeper and deeper, they come to a point where they realize that even the mind and all its thoughts and its ideas, opinions, that there's something else beyond that. There's something else that's aware of the mind, and so then they begin to uncover the presence of God within them. So as Swami Vivekananda said, all of us have all three of these levels within us simultaneously, but what we become in our experience depends on where we're focusing our attention. So the people who follow the path of praise, the path of the pleasant, all of their attention is focused on the outside world, on enjoying things in the outside world, on accomplishing things, on getting things, money and things like that. So all their attention is focused there, and their consciousness then becomes material. And that's how they think of themselves, and their consciousness primarily becomes limited to being physical. Now, the physical life, it can give you some pleasure. It can give you some joy and happiness. It can also give you some pain and some suffering and sorrow. And this is the nature of human life. With some pain, some good, some bad. And like that, we go through our life. But now the person who's moved beyond the physical, is starting to move into the mental, he's getting into a much deeper, broader universe. I mentioned that when I was in the Army, and when I went to basic training, I'd been to college, and back in those days, Vietnam was there, so right away the Army came and grabbed you, as soon as you're out of college. So I went from college, I went to basic training in the Army, and for the first time in my life, really, I was living with really ignorant, uneducated people, and who never made it, they, just past high school. And what struck me, I hadn't much appreciated my college. It's something you just did. But then, when I realized that without that college education, it had given me a much bigger world. I was aware of history, of literature, of all these things, whereas the uneducated people, they were aware of what was happening to them. I mean, it's like they had no concept of what was going on in the world, of all the kind of higher ideas and ideals of life, and so very, very narrow, very small concept of life. And so when you move from purely physical to mental, you find a huge expansion. And at the purely physical level, if you're totally living at the level of senses and sense enjoyment, you're basically living in animal enjoyment and animal life. This is what the level of the animals. But when you come to the mental level, then you become truly a human being, because it's out of the mental level that human civilization has come. All of our science, technology, all of our understanding of nature, all of our philosophy, our art, literature, everything, all of this is coming out of the mind. Not out of just the physical body, but out of the mind. So it opens up a vast new realm and begins to reveal the secrets of the universe, that vast, secrets of the universe. But then you discover that even the mental level has its ups and downs, its good and bad. As we see from experience, that practically everything they discover in science, technology, practically everything they do, it gives us a new power, whether it's electricity or anything else, nuclear power. But that power, it can be used for either good or evil. It's like they discovered how to split the atom and everything else, and the first thing they did was build a bomb. And like that, whether these forces that we find, that we uncover as we study nature and reach a deeper understanding of the laws of nature, whether these forces are actually used for good or for evil depends upon the consciousness, the spiritual consciousness of the people, the character of the people behind it. And so by itself, just the mental level, like I said, it can be both good and bad. And just as in the physical body, you can have a pleasant, healthy, energetic body, Or the body can be racked by pain. It can be racked by sickness, disease, all kinds of things can be there. And it can cause suffering. But even worse than that is the suffering that can be caused by the mind when it gets out of balance. Many people are just live extremely miserable lives. They may be healthy, perfectly fine. They may have all the physical comforts, but they're full of fear, full of anger, full of guilt, full of all kinds of things that keep them miserable all the time. And the suffering that can be caused by the mind is much more, it can be much worse than the suffering caused by the body. So at the mental level, you have these pairs of opposites. And the person who's devoted himself entirely to the mental level, to the search for truth, he realizes, as he goes on, that he's never going to find the truth. Because every time you answer one question, a new question comes. And then you go deeper and deeper, or somebody else comes along and overthrows all that you've been taught before. And like that, you're never getting to the final answer. You're never getting to the final understanding. And even worse is the brain itself can deteriorate. You know, once in Hyde Park, there was one of our neighbors. He came into the bookstore there, and he was a retired professor from the University of Chicago. Had been a professor of Jewish history. And when he was talking, you could tell he was very erudite. I mean, he had a tremendous amount of knowledge, but it was all jumbled up. You know, he couldn't, you know, everything was just all mixed up. It didn't make any sense, but you could see that there was this tremendous amount of knowledge there at one time. And so like that, even the mental level, it still has its problems, it still has its limitations. And it can be used, it can be both good or bad, happy or unhappy. But then, when you get to the deeper level, which is your deeper spiritual consciousness, this is where you find that which is a complete blessing for you and a blessing for everybody else. Because this is where you find the divinity, the presence of God within yourself, within your own consciousness. And then this begins to open up a whole new realm. Now, in the physical level, we do things and we say, okay, this will make me happy. This will give me some pleasure. Or the mental level, we have various things. We say, oh yeah, this makes me happy. This gives me joy. But like I said, like we saw, in both cases, that joy, that happiness, it can also turn to misery and suffering. But when you get to the spiritual level, it's all joy. Because it's joy, ananda bliss by its very nature. It's peace by its very nature. It's the omniscience, omnipresence, all love, everything good is there. And that's there within each individual as his own true self, his own immortal self. Now the problem we have in human life is that we get absorbed. We get absorbed in the physical world, we get absorbed in the mental world, and we forget, we lose touch with who we actually are. Now as a person becomes spiritual, and begins to become religious, or something, he says, well, okay, I want to be a good person. And so you start trying to prove yourself. You start trying to remove your bad points and start trying to increase your virtues and become a better person and so forth. And that's kind of fine. But it's only when you begin to reach the spiritual level within that it becomes, goodness automatically comes out of it. It's not you as an individual being a good, nice, holy, blessed person. It is God's goodness beginning to flow through you. And this is the whole goal of human life, is to eventually make that connection with the divine self within, with the divine reality within us, and let it function through us. Now the root cause of all our problems, this is what's called ajnana, ignorance, is based on the idea that I am something separate from God. I'm something separate from everybody else. I'm something separate from the whole universe. I am this particular person here. And usually that person is a body and a mind. And so by that we cut ourselves off. We cut ourselves off from God, we cut ourselves off from other people, we cut ourselves off from the universe, and we live in my particular kind of hole here, and then everything centers around me and my small personal life. Now when you move towards the spiritual, or you move towards the real self, the truth within yourself, the reality of your being, then you're moving towards the one universal consciousness. And then your consciousness and what you express through your being, it becomes transformed. And this is the kind of the mystical experience of union with God. At that point, the separate consciousness, the separate individuality is totally kind of forgotten, and what's there is the presence of God Himself. Yeah, I've mentioned many times in the past, how Swami Varadananda, our Swami in San Francisco, how he said that when a person goes beyond the body, goes beyond the mind, he discovers that he's pure spiritual consciousness. And he discovers that this spiritual consciousness, which is beyond body and mind, that this spiritual consciousness, which he is surrounded by a much vaster consciousness. But it's part of that consciousness, it's one. But he said that then when a person comes back from that experience of discovering his own spiritual nature, his own, the reality of his own being, when he comes back from that experience, he then realizes that that same spiritual consciousness is within everybody else. And so his whole nature has become completely transformed. He's not just a bad person trying to become a good person. He's now become that one consciousness which is the self of all. And so this is where we're all moving. This is what ultimately the purpose of our life is, and what we're trying to accomplish is to connect with that one divine universal consciousness, and then to have it flow through us. And this is very difficult for most people, because this sense of humanity, this sense of ego is so deeply ingrained, it's very difficult to kind of get beyond that. And so what Sri Ramakrishna used to say is that since it's so hard to kill the ego, to get beyond the ego, he said, rather learn how to develop the ripe ego. And he said the unripe ego, this is the ego which says, I'm so-and-so. And I've got so much education, I've got so much money, I've got so much good looks, and I'm such an important person in this world. He said that's the unripe ego. But he said the ego that says, oh, I'm just the servant of God, I'm just His child, I'm just His instrument, that ego is gradually removing the barriers between the ego, the individual, separate individual self, and the divine consciousness, so that gradually they're starting to kind of come together. So this, like Yama said right away, and this is kind of the theme for the whole book, is that the path of the good and the pleasant both present themselves towards the individual. He said most people go after the pleasant. They go after enjoying things in the world, getting things, accomplishing things, all in the outside world. He said, he said they come under my control again and again. But those who follow the path of the pleasant, they're moving away from selfishness, away from separation and ego. They're moving back towards union with God. So they're kind of moving in the right direction. So then we saw that the good and pleasant are both open to man. A wise man prefers the good after closely examining the truth and weighing their merits and demerits. A short-sighted person, however, prefers the pleasant, for he is only concerned with increasing and preserving his physical comforts. So, O Nachiketa. Now Yama says, O Nachiketa, I have tempted you again and again, but you have rejected everything I offer. Near and dear ones did not tempt you, nor even pleasant things. You were intelligent enough to understand that all worldly things are useless. You rejected them outright. Most people, however, are steeped in worldly life because they find it pleasant. So when Yama was offering Nachiketa all these kind of wonderful things, long life, prosperity, rulership, chariots and things, that he was actually testing Nachiketa, and because Nachiketa was able to reject these things and say, no, I don't want all these kind of pleasures of the world, I want to know the truth. Then Yama knew that Nachiketa was a fit student, was ready for the knowledge. So Yama had said to him that, what a wonderful person you are. I tried to tempt you in all manner of ways, but failed. Yama offered Nachiketa everything worldly people run after, but Nachiketa had no hesitation in rejecting him. Then, the good and the pleasant can never go together. If you want moral and spiritual progress, you have to forego sense pleasure. You have to practice self-discipline. A human body has a natural weakness for things that please his body and mind: food, drink, clothes, name, fame, and power, friends and relations, objects of luxury. In short, everything that satisfies his ego. His world, he is defined by his body and mind, and he cannot think that he is outside of this. But there are exceptions. Nachiketa, for instance. These people have a natural aversion for gross physical pleasures. They do not like them because such pleasures are short-lived. They prefer moral and spiritual wealth because it is enduring. Somehow or other, they know that moral and spiritual wealth is higher than material wealth, and that in order to get the former, they must give up the latter. Thus, they gladly renounce ephemeral pleasures. Renunciation is giving up smaller things for higher things. Now, in our life, we renounce all the time. For example, the student who would rather be out playing ball or watching TV or video games or something, he'll spend his hours studying the books because he knows this is a higher good. This will enable him to get to college and have a good career and job and so forth. Or the athlete who wants to win the Olympics, he trains tremendously hard, works very, very hard, because he's got to go something higher than just pleasure, than just comfort. And so like that all the time, we find that we renounce one thing in order to seek something higher. And the problem, one of the big problems that all people struggle with throughout their life is that a part of you wants to do the higher thing, and a part of you wants to do kind of the lower thing. A part of you wants to get up to meditate, another part wants to stay in bed. And so like this is like the struggle that we all face from time to time. And this is the meaning behind willpower and self-discipline, is you have the capacity to say, even though my body is saying stay in bed, no, I'll get up and meditate. And so then Yama went on to say that secular learning and spiritual learning are at opposite ends of a pole. They are different, and they have different purposes. This is well known. Nachiketa, I have found you intent on spiritual learning. I have tested you by offering you all kinds of attractive objects, but you have not shown the least interest in them. So then literally, vidya means knowledge, and avidya means ignorance. And knowledge here means self-knowledge. That knowledge which leads to perfection, which liberates a person, and which also gives him peace and happiness, the highest good. You get this knowledge by practicing discrimination and self-control. But avidya is just the opposite. You do not discriminate, you have no self-control, and you run after sense pleasures always driven by desires. You may be learned, but your learning is only for pleasure. You have no wisdom. Yama is again praising Nachiketa. This is only to emphasize the importance of renunciation. What Yama says is that you cannot worship both God and Mammon at the same time. If you want sense pleasures, you cannot have that joy that communion with God gives. Spiritual joy and physical joy are two different things. If you want one, you have to give up the other. If you crave for money, name, fame, comforts, political power, a high social standing, and things of that sort, that means that you are not interested in the pure joy of the company of God. You are following avidya, the path of enjoyment. Avidya, the path of renunciation, is a rather hard path, and it does not suit you. So is no compromise possible? Yes, it is possible, if you feel that whatever you have is for God. That is, if you feel that you are not the master, that God alone is the master. Non-attachment is the chief characteristic of this attitude, and non-attachment is only another name of renunciation, which Yama is praising in this verse. So you have vidya and avidya. Knowledge and ignorance, or also what's called paravidya and aparavidya. Supreme knowledge and secondary knowledge. Now a person can be very well educated. I mean, highly intellectual, highly intelligent, very great scholar, everything else, and still not be kind of a particularly spiritual person. And we see this in the lives of many of the great writers and artists and things like that. Their lives were just really often very temperamental and selfish and egoistic and so forth. Yeah, but they could reach kind of high levels of inspiration in their art or their writing, but their lives were not at that level. And so a person can be a wonderful chemist, total master of chemistry, and still be a really rotten person. There's no connection between his nature and the knowledge, the secular knowledge. But on the other hand, spiritual knowledge, part of it automatically transforms the person. You cannot be a bad person. You cannot be a selfish, egoistic person and reach spiritual knowledge. Now, secular knowledge is something that you get out of books, from teachers, from classes, things like that. Spiritual knowledge is something, and it's something that you acquire largely through reasoning, through the scientific method, through various ways. You study things, you analyze it, you try to reach conclusions. But spiritual knowledge is actually an intuitive knowledge that comes from within yourself. Study of scriptures, this is helpful. Preparing the ground, preparing the mind, getting things ready is a necessary thing. But true spiritual teaching or spiritual knowledge is something that comes within the individual, from his own deeper consciousness, and as it comes, it automatically begins to transform that person, so that he loses the capacity to do bad, to do evil, to harm other people. These things gradually go because, like I said, the spiritual light and the darkness, they can't combine together. Right now, that spiritual light, as we said, is within each individual, tremendously kind of bright, but through the mind we put clouds in between us and the light, between us and the sun, and so most people, we live in various stages of darkness. And a person, an ordinary person, tries to remove his ignorance by studying books, by going to college, and by trying to understand the world and so forth. He gradually tries to remove his ignorance. Now, in spiritual knowledge, it's not so much by acquiring more and more intellectual knowledge, it's by gradually removing the clouds so that the sun, the light, can begin to come into your consciousness. And then it begins to reveal to you what spiritual knowledge is, what spiritual reality is. It's not something that you can reason, that you can write a book of philosophy about and understand it. It's something that's experienced. And that comes only when, as you start to kind of remove the obstacles. And the basic obstacle is this sense of ego, of selfishness, of wanting my own personal life and wanting God to kind of stay out of it. That, as those barriers are removed, and this is happens as a person starts to develop the right ego. Instead of thinking, oh, I'm in charge here, I'm going to do what I want, I'm going to get what I want, instead of always thinking in those terms, when a sense of surrender begins to come, that not my will, but thy will be done, and I'm just the servant, I'm just the child, the instrument, and that God is the power, He's the master. As that attitude comes, then you start to kind of remove the barriers, and as you do this, then the light will begin to come, and it'll come from within your own consciousness, and it will begin to make you aware of what the truth is, of what God is. Now, at some point, as a person meditates things, at some point, he may get experiences, may come, but usually these experiences are coming from the mind, from the deeper levels of the mind, or from even a psychic level, but they're not coming from spirit. They're not coming from God. And so, and some, if a person attaches too much importance to, say, visions or voices in the head or things like that, he can get into trouble, because you're not dealing with God there, or you're dealing with a new kind of a level of the mind that you weren't aware of before. And sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. You know, but it's just all these things, all these experiences that come like this, whether they're visions or wonderful things, you just take them with a grain of salt. You just say, okay, fine, that's nice, and you, like scenery. It's like scenery along your path. You just enjoy it and say, oh yes, that was pretty, that was good. But then you realize that this isn't the goal. Now, when spiritual knowledge, on the other hand, when true spiritual knowledge starts to come, it brings with it a conviction, a sense that this is right, this is true, this is real. And it's not an intellectual idea. It's not an intellectual concept about God. It's a sense that somehow I touched some reality here. And it will frequently manifest in your external life in a different way, that you begin to realize that things are beginning to happen that I'm not doing. I never would have thought of doing this. I never would have thought of this. But suddenly things are falling into place. It's like Christ said in the Bible that it makes the crooked places straight. That when you actually started to get some connection with God, you see that this, your life starts to unfold. And gradually you realize that I don't have to worry about my life. I don't have to make it happen. I don't have to do it. There's something else here. And what that something else, as you begin to know it, you realize it knows what it's doing. It's perfectly capable of handling things wonderfully well. And so you just stop telling it what to do, and you just say, okay, thy will be done. So this transformation is of consciousness, where God, or the underlying spiritual self, the reality within you, where that becomes the center of focus, and your life then becomes an expression of that. As a human being, we may be able to express good things, or we may be nice people, or we may be express bad things and be really terrible people. But it's all very human, and it's one day we're good, next day we were cranky and we don't feel like being pleasant to anybody. And like that, we go as human beings. We go along. But when this deeper consciousness begins to function, then it becomes a blessing to you, but also a blessing to everybody else. You don't have to go out and preach about it, or try to convert people, or tell people about it. But it's just like when this light is there, or the fire is there, everybody gets the heat. Yeah, everybody that comes in contact with you will be blessed by that contact. Not because you said, oh, okay, I'm going to bless this person, but just because your very presence becomes a blessing. And this is part of the principle behind temples, holy places, things like that, is that when spiritual people live in a place, it becomes filled with that kind of vibration, that kind of presence where people feel different when they come there, and they feel uplifted. And so this is the goal. This is the gist of the scripture, is how to attain that consciousness, how to attain that oneness with God, that union with God, and then enjoy the world too. I mean, and then you see the world completely different. Normally, as a human being, with our desires, our ordinary kind of desires to have things work out the way we want, we're always struggling with life. We're always struggling with other people and with the economy and everything else, trying to make things happen the way we want them to happen. And so life is often then filled with tension and stress and anxiety and all kinds of struggle. But when you begin to give up that attitude that the world has to do what I want it to do, you know, it's the whole thing is here for me personally, and I want it to be the way I want it. When you give up that attitude and begin to let God's presence into your consciousness, then this very world begins to unfold in a wonderful way. You know, Swami Varadananda said, you know, that for the evil person, for the bad person, this world is hell. He looks around, he sees bad people all over. And so you read like about hitmen and people like that, they become extremely paranoid as they get older because they see everywhere around they're seeing all these horrible criminal types that they associate with. On the other hand, if a person is good, he tends to attract good company, good people, and he tends to then see a very happy kind of a good life. So Swamiji said, you know, for the good person, this world is heaven. But he said for the yogi, this very world is God himself. So as we begin to move towards spiritual consciousness, towards the presence of God within, we begin to see everything as an expression of divinity. And then everything becomes sacred. Everything becomes filled with the presence of God. Every work, every action we take, it ultimately becomes worship. And like that, the whole consciousness, which determines kind of the quality of our life, our whole consciousness begins to be transformed until we're always living in the presence of God. Sometimes we're meditating with our eyes closed, trying to find God within. Other times we open our eyes and we see God without. And this is the correct vision. And this unfolds a world of tremendous beauty. A world that simply that was always there, but simply we weren't aware of it because we didn't have the eyes to see it. So as you transform your consciousness, as it becomes more spiritual, you're totally transforming your whole experience of the world. You'll find that the problems and things, once you give up the desire that things have to work out this particular way, the way I want it, once you kind of let go of that, then you see that the things that happen, whether they're good or bad, they don't disturb you. On the other hand, you're finding everything filled with kind of a wonderful joy and happiness. And this is what's meant by the spiritual life, is that the spiritual person is one who finds all of his contentment, all of his happiness, all of his completeness, he finds within himself. Because he discovers, oh, there's this other level of being here within me. And as soon as you find that, then you have the sense that, oh, everything is fine now. Everything is good. And you realize that you don't depend on other people or other things or other situations. You don't depend on them at all for your happiness. Now, when you depend on a person, another person for your happiness, then you've got kind of a stranglehold on that person. You're saying, make me happy. You want to do something, but behave. Make me, give me joy. And so your relationship is one of kind of selfishness and grabbing and conflict. But when you find that everything is being satisfied within yourself, then you look at the world without any strings attached, without needing anything from anybody. And then naturally, you find that love and helpfulness and joy begins to manifest. Because you're not depending on the external forms, of this particular form or this particular form. You say, okay, I love this form, but that form I don't like at all. Now you're finding love within, and then everywhere you go, you'll find that love. Everywhere you go, you'll find your happiness. You'll find your peace. Once you've found it inside, if you're always trying to find it somehow outside, it's always coming and going. We may have a peaceful moment, and then again, the turmoil comes and things like that. But when you have it inside, then it's completely fulfilling. So Yama has shown that he's not interested in trying to find happiness or anything else in the outside world. He wants to know what's the real truth within. So then said, those who are steeped in worldly pleasure think that they are intelligent and that they know the scriptures well. They are like blind people being led by other blind people. They go round and round, always pursued by sorrow. So this world is filled with people who don't know what's going on, but they've always got an opinion. They've always got happy to give you advice on what you should do. You remember Sal Bellow? He used to be, he was a Nobel Prize winning writer. He used to be at University of Chicago. And about University of Chicago, he referred to it as the last bastion of people who know what they're talking about. And this is the principle, is that the world is full of people who don't know what they're talking about, and the less they know, often the stronger their opinions are. So like that, we're all like the blind running around, in the world. It's only those people who realize God, that actually know what truth is. Everybody else, we're just kind of guessing. And so, and this is one of the obstacles that a person faces if he wants to be spiritual. If he does, yes, I want to follow the spiritual path. He said, almost all of his friends and companions are going to say, oh, you're becoming a religious nut, or why are you doing that? Why waste your time with that? And so now it's changed quite a bit. In American culture, the ideas of yoga, meditation, of a spiritual search, a true spiritual, this has entered into American culture now. But it didn't used to be there. And so like a typical American attitude was, why are you sitting in a corner doing nothing? Go out and get a job, do something, make something happen, do good to the world. But the idea, this inner dimension, was pretty much lacking. So when a person decides he wants to be religious, or wants to be spiritual, wants to get more, tendencies that you'll find that all your friends, companions, and things, they'll tend to discourage you. They'll say, oh, why aren't you going out, with us anymore, and things like that. And so it's a struggle in the beginning to and sometimes involves necessity to separate yourself kind of from the circle of friends you may have now and find a different circle. And this is the value of satsang, is it gives that psychological support that you find, there are other people who also believe in these same ideals, these same goals, and I'm not alone. I'm not just all crazy. I'm actually, there are other people who appreciate that. So you eventually, that satsang, particularly in the beginning, is a great help, because it just gives a psychological kind of support. Whereas if you're in the wrong people, wrong crowd, it tends to drag you down. And often it will knock a person kind of off the path. It just kind of pulls them off the path. This is like Sri Ramakrishna said, that when you first plant a little tree, or a little plant, you have to fence it around. and because it's very fragile, it can be easily destroyed. He said later on, when it grows up into a full-size tree, then he said it doesn't matter, you can tie an elephant to it and it won't matter. In the same way, when a person's developed sufficiently spiritually, he knows, this is it, this is the truth, nothing can convince me otherwise. And so he's on solid ground, and no matter who he mixes with, what kind of people, it won't throw him off his balance. But in the beginning, when all this is fairly new and fairly weak, being with the wrong people is particularly telling the wrong people about your spiritual life tends to make you doubt what you're doing. It tends to undermine your confidence, your faith, your sense that you're on the right path, and can actually kind of pull the person off the path for maybe this whole life. I just never get back on it. So those who are steeped in worldly pleasure think that they are intelligent and that they know the scriptures well. He says they are like blind people leading the blind. They go round and round, always pursued by sorrow. And then there are worldly people, too attached to their families. They may also be very proud of their wealth. The world mesmerizes them, and they become childish. They think that the world they see around them is the only world that exists, and they do not believe there is any other world. It therefore never occurs to them that they should perform duties preparatory to their journey to the next world. Such people come under my control again and again. So some worldly people never think of their life after death. They may not even believe that there is such a thing. And they do not therefore make any preparations for it. They are only concerned with what is present. It is the world they see, feel, and live in that matters. And since they do not see any other world, it does not exist, and they do not worry about it. They have children, they have money, they have plenty of things to enjoy, and they are happy. The world has so bewitched them that they have become thoughtless and childish. They do not recognize that life has a purpose, which is the attainment of self-knowledge. Only a human being can attain self-knowledge, for he can think, argue, and discriminate, and he can reject the pleasant for the good. If he does not try to attain self-knowledge, then his life is in vain. By only living for sense pleasure, he commits suicide. He is born again and again, and is completely at the mercy of Yama. A thoughtful person always keeps the goal of life in view, the attainment of self-knowledge. Everything he does is directed to that goal. If a person does not direct his life that way, he is foolish and immature. So for many people, like I said, they're so absorbed in this world and in their desires for this world that they tend to become born again and again. When the soul leaves the body, when you come to the end of this life, the soul leaves the body, it takes with it the subtle impressions, the desires, the tendencies, the focus of what it's been focused on during its life. It tends to take those things with it, and if its desires are mostly kind of worldly, then it will take on another body in order to express those desires, to enjoy them, to be able to fulfill them. So like that, an average soul, let's say an ordinary person, they go to kind of afterlife, some little spiritual realm, but then again they'll come back to earth in order to experience another life, to get other experiences, and to desires that may have been frustrated in the previous life, they can now express. They can now find a body and conditions in order to express that. And so they keep going, life after life, trying to enjoy and experience different things. Whereas the spiritual person, the path of Shreyas, he's realizing that all of this, continually seeking more power, more enjoyment, more this or that, he realizes eventually that this is all like a child playing with toys. You know, a child plays with toys, and then and that's fine for the child. That's fine. It gives them happiness. But eventually, really, he gets tired of that. And then he begins to realize that what is the ultimate truth? What is the purpose of all this? Where am I going? What am I trying to do? And he begins to seek this higher type of knowledge and starts to then move out. And eventually, the person realizes that he doesn't need a body. He's the whole universe. His consciousness, the consciousness within each individual, is actually the consciousness behind everything. And so that is you leaving that consciousness in order to take on a little body and become rich or become this or that, you know, that becomes gradually meaningless. And so the person leaves that behind and starts to move higher. It's like the individual who, as a child, we had toys, and we loved to play with the toys, and they gave us great happiness. But as an adult, we don't play with our toys anymore. You know, they don't matter to us anymore. We're seeking something higher. But even as adults, most people, they're seeking toys like house, car, place in society, respect, all these things. You know, we're still playing kind of in the world, but just, you know, at a higher level. At a higher level there, still though, the person begins to think beyond this world towards what's the real purpose of things? What's the ultimate truth of things? Or what is God? How can I actually experience God? Then he's moving out of this chain of constantly thinking that I need a body in order to satisfy myself. You begin to go beyond that. Okay, so this is actually what we had kind of covered before, and so that brings us up to date. So any questions on anything we covered? Okay. So tomorrow, Saturday, Swami Varadananda is going to give a talk at the Hindu temple on eternal India. He's going to talk about the history of the culture, the nature of India, and this is going to be the start of a series of talks. He's going to be talking the first Saturday of every month from 11:30 to 12:30. He'll be talking at the Hindu temple in the Vivekananda Spiritual Center. So that is going to be tomorrow, is going to be there. Then he'll give the talk on Sunday on meditation, why we should meditate, his theory and practice. He'll also do the class next Tuesday on the Gospel of Ramakrishna. So these are all coming up, and we're working on the celebration of Swami Vivekananda's 150th birth anniversary, which is going to take place in November. The main program, the main celebration will be on November 9th. It'll be called Chicago Calling, and we're expecting an audience of like 1,500 and maybe 2,000 people. And then also, we've invited monks from all over the world outside of India, all the foreign centers outside of India. We've invited them to come. We've invited all the American Swamis to come. And so we're expecting to have about 50 Swamis here. We're hoping to get devotees from all over the world, from Japan and Sri Lanka, you know, all places coming too. And then our whole program will be from November 6th to the November 11th. So the 6th, everybody arrived. The 7th, we'll take them to Ganges. The monks will take up to Ganges. And then on the 8th, they'll have a monks conference, International Monks Conference. There, Ganges, the General Secretary of the whole order will be there. So then they come back. That evening, they come back to Chicago, to Homerglen, and then we have our main celebration, Chicago Calling, celebrating Swami Vivekananda's 150th birth anniversary, plus the 120th anniversary of the Parliament of Religions. Then the next day, the 10th Sunday, we'll have International Devotees Conference, where all these devotees from all over the world, and all of our devotees and all the other centers, we'll all have a conference. And then on the 11th, there's most likely going to be a program at the Art Institute on just dedicated to Swami Vivekananda on It's in Fullerton Hall there, and then do a tour of places connected with Vivekananda. So all this is underway. The dates are pretty well set. The details may change. Invitations have already gone out to all the swamis, and we were getting responses back. So that's coming up, and that's going to be a kind of a major event. This 150th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda is a huge thing in India, particularly. There's been since 2010 and on. There's been all kinds of big programs going on, and so but everybody's looking to Chicago, as a place where he achieved kind of world renown. So everybody's looking forward to Chicago to do something really kind of major. So that's coming up. Om Asatoma Satyamya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityurmam Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Oh Lord, you lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. You lead us from death to immortality. Om peace, peace,